Order, order. Welcome to the Treasury Select Committee on Wednesday, the 5th of November 2025. This is part of our sessions on the budget, which is coming, of course, on the 26th of November of this year. And as part of that, we've got two former economic ministers at cabinet level in front of us. We're pleased to welcome Right Honourable Sir Vince Cable, who of course served as business secretary in the coalition years, and the Right Honourable George Osborne, who was served as Chancellor during that period, I think 6 years in total. So welcome to you. And what I would be very clear about is that today we're talking about the 2025 budget, so we're not particularly going over your record in government, tempting though that may be, but we're keen to hear what it's like for people who are in the hot seat at the time. So perhaps if I could start with you, Mr. Osborne. You've been in the hot seat. You have to face all of the slings and arrows, what the media say, all the speculation, the lobbying from colleagues, and you're one of the only handful of people alive who've actually been through that. So that's one of the reasons we wanted you here. Can you give us some insight into the factors the Chancellor will be having to consider right now and what it feels like in the Treasury?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for having me back. And I have lots of happy memories of young Labour MPs like Wes Streeting and Rachel Reeves quizzing me at the Treasury Select Committee. I think the thing about a budget is, gone are the days when we live in a closed economy where everyone kind of tunes in on budget day, as I sort of remember from my childhood. And, that has a direct impact on the currency and the stock market and so on. I mean, it can have an impact on those things, but that's normally when the budget's gone wrong. And today, and certainly when I was Chancellor, it's a kind of all of government organising event, as is in my day, we had a spring budget and an autumn statement, and Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling before me had a pre-budget report. In effect, you have sort of two budget-like events a year. And they're very useful organising moments for government to arrange its domestic policy around. The Chancellor is obviously at the centre of things, negotiating with cabinet colleagues about what's going to be in that. And then very specifically working hopefully in partnership with the Prime Minister. And so I think you start with, there's nothing that can appear in the budget that the Prime Minister doesn't want to appear. There's nothing that can appear in the budget that the Chancellor doesn't want to appear. And so you have a kind of double lock on these kind of key events. And ultimately, the decision-making is in a very tight circle. So in my case, and I turn to Dr. Cable, of course, there was this other key element, which was I couldn't announce anything that the Liberal Democrats would not ultimately support in the division lobbies later. And there was a kind of negotiation inside the coalition. But that was kind of specific to them. I think in a single-party government, and I did do two budgets in a single-party government, it's really a kind of negotiation with inside Downing Street. And I think the kind of central thing, we can come on to kind of, all the different considerations. There are around 4,000 decisions in a budget. Many of them are kind of on a sort of tractor beam of things that, frankly, almost anyone doing the job would probably do. And so you're looking for what are the things that are distinctive for my party and my government, what is distinctive for me personally as Chancellor, my personal priorities. And I think what you ideally want to do, which is probably not the case today, is you'll want your first budget to sort of set out the stall, and then your second and third budgets to be kind of topping up and reinforcing and kind of building on what you've announced. You don't really want your second budget to be as sort of unknown as your first budget. But that's, I think there's a sort of trying to maintain consistency whilst you've got all these things swirling around you, the OBR forecast, the mood of the parliamentary party, the politics inside the cabinet. But and I would say the main thing, which is often sort of gets lost, is in some ways the opening sentence of the budget, which is people often focus on the last sentence of the budget or the big kind of reveal, which most chancellors have at the end. But I think that what's lost is the first sentence of the budget. What is this budget about? Can you sum it up in a sentence so that you can explain to Parliament, to the media, and therefore to the public what this whole mass of measures is really about?
Okay, well, Vince, you had to go out and explain a budget that was set by a Chancellor and not of your own party. but obviously you had to buy into that. So what was it like from your perspective?
Well, first of all, add my thanks for the invitation. I used to be a member of your committee, actually, in the days when Gordon Brown was the Chancellor.
Everyone's reliving their old glories, which were clearly in this committee, so that's good to hear.
No, I think George has given a very, fair assessment of the process. There have been a lot of criticisms of the coalition on policy grounds, and I would defend it. But the process was actually very good, and as a result of being able to resolve issues internally, we were able to provide 5 years of stable government around a framework which George has just described. I'll just make one comment which I think links to the present day. I was told in the first few days of the formation of the coalition government by all the senior economic advisors to the government, senior civil servants, that the overriding concern for the country was the pressure from external bond markets, and that we had to observe, whatever else we did, strict fiscal discipline, and that provided a motivation for the initial budgets, but continuing, and a recognition that we were operating in a goldfish bowl. We were under constant supervision from external markets, and I think I'm very conscious that the present Chancellor is under exactly the same pressure.
Okay, and well, I think the 2022 really underlined that as well. So we've got the budget coming up. The Chancellor's been very clear. Growth is one of her, repeated words, and the focus on growth. Do you think that's the right strategy to get the financial situation of the country on track, Sir Vince?
I wrote an article a few months ago, which I strolled to write, but it was called "What is Rachel Getting Right?" And I think there are several things which are relatively positive. I think, first of all, the acceptance of the fact that you need to operate within a disciplined financial framework and independent central bank. I think, secondly, the fact that she managed to do what we didn't do in coalition, which was to prioritise public investment and to give it a role within the fiscal rules, counting public assets in the counting of net debt. And I think the other thing was to give a sense of direction that the overall bias of public spending and taxation is essentially to defend the interests of old fogies like me, and that the new government had to redirect the priorities elsewhere. I mean, you can argue that it's dealt with this rather cack-handedly with the winter fuel allowance, which probably should have been treated as a taxable benefit rather than abolished, but nonetheless the direction was right. And I just add one other thing, although I think there's a sort of general consensus that the economic position at the moment is pretty dire. It's also dire in all other Western democracies for rather similar reasons. Growth is very slow everywhere, productivity growth, possibly exception of Spain. Almost all Western countries have public debt, which is unsustainable, particularly extreme in the United States, but a widely shared problem. We have this exceptional problem of vulnerability to attack by external creditors because we're very much reliant on external borrowing as a country. But I think trying to make a fair assessment, and I came here not to try to score partisan points. I think we have to acknowledge that the Chancellor has made some correct moves and is genuinely constrained by factors which apply to all Western democracies at the moment.
Mr. Osborne.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Vince is saying, and I have quite a lot of sympathy for the Chancellor's position. But I think in that situation, it's all the more important to therefore have a clear plan. And when I was doing the job, the Treasury Secretary at the time, the US Treasury Secretary at the time, Tim Geithner, had a great phrase, which was "plan beats no plan." And people can argue about what happened back then, but if the government can communicate a kind of clear sense, it's got a, you might not like the plan, but it's got a plan. That is in itself instills confidence. And I would say kind of one of the challenges at the moment is it's not really clear what the priorities are. So, you say growth is the priority. I mean, the Chancellor gave a speech yesterday in which growth was not the priority. Cutting NHS waiting lists, reducing the deficit, and the cost of living were the three priorities. And that is different from what the government said a year ago. So I would sort of urge them to settle on a set of priorities. And the thing about growth is, there's not some big lever on the desk of the Chancellor or the business secretary that you can just sort of pull and you get growth, and there are lots of external constraints to it. And indeed, of course, Nobel Prize winning economists will vehemently disagree with each other about what produces growth and what are the right ingredients, and whether you should deregulate or regulate, spend more public money or cut taxes or whatever it happens to be. I think one thing I would sort of not take issue with, Vince, but sort of there is a bit of an outlier in the West at the moment. Now, maybe not so much this year because of its self-inflicted wounds with tariffs, but the United States economy has been more productive over the last 4 or 5 years than the Western European, including UK economies. And something has happened. There's a sort of detachment, but if you look back to the 1990s or the 2000s or the period when we were in office, obviously the United States was in some degrees more dynamic, a bit more capitalist. The tech sector was emerging. But you always felt we were within touching distance, and certainly the capital city here, London, was a contender for the global financial centre. And I think there is definitely a feeling, which I detect and I teach at Stanford University in California, a sense that the US has pulled away. The productivity numbers in the US are markedly better than Europe. And therefore you have to ask yourself kind of what is it that they are getting right, particularly if you think their political system is quite dysfunctional and unable to kind of organise things particularly well. And the big innovation that's happening in artificial intelligence, I would observe it's interesting that so much of that is coming out of the United States. It's also coming out of China, but it's coming out of the United States. And it's not even necessarily coming from the incumbents. It's coming from brand new companies that 2 or 3 years ago barely existed and suddenly are worth more than much of the FTSE put together. So I think, it is worth looking at what the US is doing to...
Do you think the government's right to lean into AI?
I think the government's right to lean into AI, not least because it's happening anyway, so you want to harness it to the best of your advantage as an economy.
Will it create growth or just mean people lose their jobs?
Well, I think it's possible it might do both. So I think it will lead to productivity gains. It might help enormously with this challenge that Vince alludes to, which is how do you make these overly indebted Western economies deliver better public services. But it's obviously, it seems to me obvious that it's going to lead to a massive dislocation in jobs. And I would say that historically, if you look at the UK, if you look at the 1980s, you look at the post-war period, you look at the Victorian period, when there's a big change in technology, there are a lot of casualties. Yep. And frankly, although government talks about retraining people, in practice, it's quite often parked people onto incapacity benefits.
Mr. Gay, could I ask just, if you reflect on nearly 10 years now since the coalition ended, and if you look at the sort of level of GDP growth, I think there's only 1 year it's been above 2.5%, apart from the aberration of COVID and immediately after. Is there not a risk that the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, faces a situation where sort of society's expectations are bound by a level of welfare, level of investment in public services that is in direct contradiction, isn't compatible with the level of performance in the UK economy, and that essentially there's a disconnect between the politics and the economic reality? And did you recognise that? And if you do, how does she reset?
If that's addressed to me.
Yes.
I think up to a point. I mean, look, again, I'm actually, not unlike Vince, I'm quite sort of unpartisan these days, or trying at least attempt to be. And the increase in public expenditure and taxation that the UK has seen started in 2019. It didn't start with the election of a Labour government last year. That is when GDP starts to grow, that's when state spending as a share of GDP starts to increase, and that's when taxes start to increase. And you could say we're moving to a more kind of continental model of higher tax, higher public expenditure, but with a whole load of pressures, much driven by demographics, that mean that fundamentally that's the sort of new resting place we're going to find ourselves. But I would say that the trade-off to that is probably a less dynamic economy over time, and that's going to be the kind of challenge you allude to. I think the kind of one of the big tasks for any government and parliament is to constantly look at how you can try and reform your public services. When I was an opposition MP under Tony Blair's government, a big theme of that government was domestic reform of education, healthcare and welfare and so on, and I would argue the coalition did quite a lot of that as well, some successfully, some less successfully. But I feel that sort of quite a lot of the sort of public service reform program, which helps address this problem of affordability, has kind of run into the sand a bit under all part. It's not really a particularly party point. Who's got the big new ideas on reforming education, and which used to be the big battleground when I was in Parliament? Well, who's got the big ideas on reforming healthcare, welfare? There's been the parliamentary problems for the government this year. That seems to me a missing part of the British political conversation at the moment.
We're going to move on sort of to some specifics, and one specific thing for you, Mr. Osborne, you set up the Office of Budget Responsibility. There's been a lot of swirling noise around that, and rumours that the Chancellor would rather have one forecast a year. What's your views on that?
Well, look, when I set up the Office for Budget Responsibility, it was an opposition idea. It was because there had been, I think it's quite hard to remember, although you will remember, that back before it was created, the Chancellor of the Exchequer would announce the growth forecasts, the inflation forecasts, the forecasts of what taxes would raise, what planning reforms would deliver in terms of GDP growth. They would be Treasury numbers, and the Treasury wouldn't show any of its workings. In fact, once in opposition, that all leaked, and people started to say, well, hold on, how do they arrive at these sums? So there was a big kind of credibility problem around government forecasts. And the OBR was an attempt to provide a neutral and independent forecast, which doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be right, because forecasts are hard to get right, but it's independent.
Do you think it should have two, or would you have any sympathy for it to move down?
No, I think the problem is not how many forecasts. I think it should have two a year, and it's had, I think it was the 1970s, the Labour government in the 1970s that set the precedent. I think in fact it was Tony Benn who insisted that the government produce two forecasts a year. But I would sort of to make two observations about the OBR. I think, it in part the government is a victim of having set a very narrow headroom. So every single change in any part of the OBR forecast puts it into trouble potentially, and therefore Treasury officials quite understandably go to the OBR and say, the Indian trade deal the Prime Minister signed should add 0.3% to GDP, not 0.2% to GDP, because it makes a big difference if you're putting a budget together, and probably means you can avoid one of the difficult tax rises that you might be anticipating. So you get into, at the same time, I have enormous affection and support for the OBR. I think the OBR itself can back off a bit, having these conversations with the government and trying to second guess, well, what does this planning reform do? What does this Indian trade deal do? Will these immigration changes affect? You get drawn into sort of micro forecasts, which when they aggregate, quite a problem. So it's a kind of, I think that if both sides sort of step back a bit and get back to the idea of just this is a kind of independent referee, by the way, principally for parliamentarians, to say, okay, well, this is an independent forecaster's given us a view. The government, by the way, is entitled to reject that view in the Act, but all chancellors have accepted the OBR forecast. And then it's a sort of level playing field that then you can have the partisan argument.
Just add to that. I mean, I think there is a danger of the OBR just becoming a kind of whipping boy for political failures, and it's actually more necessary than ever given the precariousness of our external position. I think what has happened, and I don't think it's the fault of the OBR, is that it's moved from a position of just marking the government's exam papers to setting the exam questions, and they're very difficult questions, and things like projecting future productivity growth, which are virtually impossible, are probably things that should be done inside the Treasury rather than subcontracting to the OBR.
Okay, thank you. So if we can get sort of into tighter questions and answers, because we're hoping that you might have some thoughts about what could be in the budget on 26th of November. Jim Dixon, MP.
Very important one. Obviously, the central focus of the budget is how the Chancellor can increase tax revenues to pay for investment in public services and other priorities. Do you have any thoughts on what sensible measures to increase revenue might be, perhaps improve the tax system at the same time? There's lots of talk around on things like property taxes, how you treat pensions from a taxation point of view, food. Mr. Osborne, you might not want to be reminded about the way you change taxation on food, but ideas around that would be sensible for the Chancellor to adopt. Both of you, please.
Vince.
I think a substantial tax increase is unavoidable. There's a political problem of making this promise before the election, but I'll put that on one side. But in terms of economic necessity, it's very difficult to see how it can be avoided. And I think before giving more specific suggestions, I think we need to try to get away from this what is presented as a truism that somehow Britain is overtaxed. I mean, our tax level in relation to GDP is fairly close to the OECD average. Part of the problem is where we have an aspiration for Scandinavian public services, but we don't have Scandinavian levels of tax to pay for it. But in terms of what has to happen, I think it's almost certain that the Chancellor will need to use a broad-based tax. Income tax is the obvious one. But I would just make the point that these things are not just easier politically to present, but better policy if it's combined with tax reform. I mean, we have an extraordinarily complicated and perverse system of taxation. And if an income tax rise were coupled with integration of the national insurance system on employees, partial integration or stepping stone to effectively making the two the same, I think would be a very positive step. I think the other issue you mentioned was property taxation. I think you're absolutely right that the government will move in that direction. I think I probably have a patent out on the proposal for a mansion tax, but and something of that kind may well happen, but it would be much better if it were done as part of making the property tax system more coherent generally, whether it's a move to proportional taxation of property values, taking in, hopefully, getting rid of some of the worst features of the stamp duty system. That would, I think, be much more satisfactory than just doing ad hoc small changes that annoy people and don't necessarily create a better or fairer tax system.
Could they be done in time for the 26th for the budget? To
Sorry?
bring money? Could they be done in time to bring money in if you take that wider approach?
Okay. Sorry, I didn't.
So could property tax, to do that change to property taxes in the round? We're discussing property taxes actually next week.
Well, it'd be very difficult to do it in one
Yep.
swing, but I certainly would support the move to having taxation on higher value property. I think it's something we discussed in the coalition, and we came to a reasonably good compromise at the time, but we now need to refer to it.
Mr. Osborne.
Yeah, I mean, I think tax rises are inevitable. I mean, I would say you've got to put them alongside expenditure reductions and constraints. I mean, I think the Chancellor is getting it right in saying, I've set out fiscal rules and I'm going to stick to the fiscal rules. I think this government and the country have become completely unanchored and vulnerable to the bond market pressures that Vince was talking about if it just abandons these rules. So having set the rules, and they're pretty sensible rules. You then face this problem. You've got a budget deficit of almost 5%. You've got debt at 100% GDP. I think to say it's all going to be done with tax is as wrong as saying it's all going to be done with public expenditure cuts. And I was the Chancellor who increased VAT from 17.5% to 20% and introduced additional taxation of pensions and higher stamp duty on higher value properties and so on. So I also did tax increases as well as the things I'm more known for, which were the expenditure reductions. So I think it should be a mix, and it will be very wrong, one-sided and a mistaken budget if it's all on tax rises. And then you face the well, what do you do? It's obviously easier to go for one of the big three taxes: income tax, national insurance, or VAT. Of course, the government is constrained by its promise, and maybe it will choose to break that promise. It's difficult to break a manifesto promise, speaking from a sort of political point of view, but actually the Sunak-Boris Johnson government increased national insurance, having promised in its 2019 manifesto that it wouldn't, and used COVID as the reason why it wouldn't do that. And that passed through Parliament. I mean, it was subsequently reversed by the Truss government, but and then retained as one of the few things of the Truss budget that was retained. So you can get away. I'm not sure you can get away. But you can certainly, that government passed it through Parliament, and if it had made it to the general election, might have been able to argue why it had necessary. And you can use kind of extenuating circumstances. Yeah. But I would say when it comes, the trouble is if you don't use one of the big taxes, you are left with lots of little ones. And I would argue partly the problem last year was a lot of increased capital gains tax, changes to the non-dom regime. Maybe individually defendable, but you put them all together and it gives an overall impression of the UK is quite anti-enterprise or anti-foreign wealth. And the risk is if the whole is substantial in this budget and the Chancellor has to do sort of 10 taxes, it's pretty messy and it falls foul of what I was saying earlier, which is what's your one message you're trying to communicate.
Just one quick follow-up. So Vince, you wrote that a 1% rise in VAT would raise 7 billion, and you felt that this was still below what other countries are capable of raising through that measure. Do you think that the UK ought to perhaps take that option?
Well, value-added tax is 25%, I think, in every one of the 5 or 6 Scandinavian countries. And again, if we want those levels of services, that's the kind of tax structure one would have to think about. I wouldn't recommend it for this budget for the obvious reason that it would make a significant impact on cost of living, inflation in the short run, and would be very difficult to reconcile with the other objectives of government.
Thank you. Yuan Yang MP.
Thank you very much, Chair. You both mentioned the mansion tax, or the tax on the council tax, and increasing and revaluing some council tax bands, which was a coalition government proposal back from 2012. I'm curious about the political economy of that. What were the difficulties in discussing that within the coalition and getting that enacted? What do you think would be the challenges nowadays?
Well, the main challenge was the First Lord of the Treasury overruled me at the time, so it didn't happen. But we managed to keep it secret at the time. But what we had agreed, now with the passage of time, inside the coalition and between myself and and my Liberal Democrat colleagues, Vince and Nick Clegg and Danny Alexander, was that we would introduce 2 additional bands of council tax for high value properties. I think from memory, one over 2 million. Back then, houses worth more than £2 million, houses worth more than £5 million, of which at the time there were 55,000 in the country out of around 24 million homes. Almost all of which were in West London, has to be said. Now represented by Labour MPs, I should point out. But the crucial thing was the money raised from that was going to be used to reduce the top rate of income tax from 50p, which had been the last act of the Brown government, to 40%, which is where it had been throughout the Blair government. So it was going to be a 50 to 40 reduction in income tax and an increase in property tax to pay for it. And then for perfectly good, sound political reasons, David Cameron felt the Conservatives had promised not to have a mansion tax, under pressure in opposition from Dr. Cable and others. And he also thought in 2012 reducing the top rate of income tax from 50% to 40% in one go was too much politically, essentially. And so we settled on 45% and a series of small taxes, including taxes on hot food, to pay for it.
But it's David Cameron's fault, the passage.
It's not David Cameron's fault, but it's a good example of by the way, that is a good example of tax reform being quite hard when you're trying to raise taxes. Tax reform's a great thing, everyone's in favour of tax reform, but you usually create losers, and so it's generally easier to do tax reform when you're cutting tax and you can kind of buy off the losers, whereas if you're raising tax, and extending VAT boundaries, that's much harder. But I think, to come back, the simplest way to do a property tax in the UK, I mean, you can do what the New York State has or California has, which is just a percentage of the value of the house, which you pay each year. But that would be quite a revolution for the UK. And you remember you have to go and value the value of all these properties all the time, which is kind of a big challenge. And I think, when they tried to revalue council tax bands in Wales, it was not very popular a few years ago. So the idea was you would have these two additional bands, but crucially, the money was going to be used to reduce taxes on high incomes. So,
Mr. Osborne, you mentioned at the start of that answer that you said the Treasury overruled you. Could you go a bit more into
the Prime Minister overruled me.
The Prime Minister
the Prime Minister overruled me. I say overruled me, but we're still very good friends, and so it was never that kind of relationship. But I thought he made sound political arguments about why it would be a difficult sell. And there's a general point, by the way, I should have made at the beginning. Budgets when the economy is doing badly are really tough. 2012, which was my toughest budget for me personally, was also the year when it looked like we were in a recession. I was off my kind of fiscal targets, and so the context in which you're standing up makes a big difference for a chancellor as well.
Is there anything you wanted to add to that description?
Well, your original question was what's the political economy of this measure? I think the honest point one has to acknowledge, although I advocated it, was it doesn't actually raise very much revenue, which is why I would argue now that you probably have to go rather further, and that's why the point George just mentioned about moving towards a more proportional system of taxing property is something one should be aiming for, though it's not, as he said, not at all straightforward. The other politics point that we all had to deal with, including me, because even the Lib Dems had people living in very high value properties, was people who are sort of income poor but asset rich.
All the Lib Dem seats, isn't it?
Making them enrichment.
And how do you? And there are ways of dealing with that. Of course, you can obviously downsize. You can use equity release. You can use renting of very large properties. I mean, there are answers to it, but if it were done, and I would believe it should be done, there would be quite a strong political reaction from people in that position, and you've got to have an answer for that.
Thank you, Joe. Mr. Osborne, you mentioned just now that it's, of course, more difficult to raise than to lower taxes, and earlier that the government is to some extent a victim of the low headroom, 10 billion pounds in headroom, which is the same level actually under Jeremy Hunt, so kind of post-2022 lower headroom than before the pandemic. Do you feel then it was irresponsible for Jeremy Hunt to cut national insurance by 2p, which would have doubled the headroom if he had not taken that measure?
I think I will just on the headroom point. I mean, he was a chancellor at the end of a parliament facing an election a year away. He knew he had an election, and he just has to get through 1 year and deliver. I mean, in theory, the political theory is you want to kind of land on the election day with no headroom, right? Because you use your last budget to deliver the headroom either for expenditure increases or tax cuts, depending on your party or your manifesto. it's very different from the first budget of a parliament, where you're hoping to be the Chancellor for the whole of that parliament, in which case you are delivering a big headroom so you can deal with changes in the forecast. And in crude political terms, you've got your war chest, which your party will expect you to deploy as you get close to the general election. I mean, that may not how it's supposed to be in the economic textbooks. That is how it's in the political textbooks. And so I think the kind of error last year for the Labour government was, having got elected big majority 4 or 5 year parliament, you want to build a big headroom, and then you can weather the storms, and then get towards the end and do what you want to do to try and get yourself re-elected. In terms of for Jeremy Hunt, I mean, I had a lot of sympathy that the political pressure on him from his own party is he's got to deliver something to try and help win the general election. I didn't choose to reduce national insurance, and I think there's a kind of it's a bit of a simplistic way to think about politics, that I've delivered a tax cut, therefore people are going to re-elect me. I think people want an overall sense. Who is it? Have you got a grip on the economy? Are you people who look like you're in charge of events? And am I feeling better off as a person? And I might not know. I mean, there used to be a cruel test, like, well, what's the rate of national insurance, that they used to throw at MPs on interviews, and back then. And I just think the overall objective should be for people to feel better off, and for people to feel that their economic future is secure with this government. And that's the confidence they need to exude, which they're not currently exuding.
You mentioned then what's in the political textbooks, the political incentive to spend down the whole headroom, in effect handing over to a new government without any rainy day reserves in case of turbulence. And under that logic that you just described, every 5 years there'd be a running down of headroom, and then a huge budget, and then a running down over 5 years, which is the opposite of what a country would not want for stable growth. How do we get out of that economic imperative, that political imperative that is caused by the current fiscal framework?
Well, I think you can get out of it. First of all, like, elections cost in democracies. They just, that's just a factor. Like, as I used to say to the Treasury, unfortunately we've got a general election. That's like the nature of our system. And if the Treasury was around, they'd have no budgets and no elections. But but if you kind of, I think I would. Other people will judge whether the coalition government, or given the election result in 2015, the Conservative message on what came to be known as austerity or fiscal prudence, it commanded public support at the time. I know that's not how people remember it now, but it did, and it got us re-elected. I would say Gordon Brown, in the early phase, his prudence for a purpose. I'm paying down the national debt. I'm using the mobile phone spectrum sales to pay down. That was a very compelling message for a Labour government, that you could trust the government with the public finances, and they weren't immediately spending everything that they raised. And I remember I was in opposition at the time. It was extremely hard to kind of find our way through it. So to your point, I think governments that exude prudence, caution, small c fiscal conservatism, do get re-elected, have historically in Britain, and I thought, again, coming back to the Chancellor's speech yesterday, she says, like, reduce the deficit, cut waiting lists, cost of living. Well, in some ways, reduce the deficit sits above those things by reducing the deficit, by being fiscally prudent and conservative. I am going to be able to afford to help you with your cost of living. I'm going to be able to afford you with your afford reductions in waiting lists in the health service and so on. So there's more of a hierarchy there than just having them as sort of 3 random things I want to achieve.
I'm trying to get into some specifics, so I'm going to bring Bobby Dean in. Mr. Dean.
Yeah, I was explaining to colleagues before this that I wrote my master's dissertation on British newspaper reporting and mansion tax, but I'm not going to continue to persist because I've got 1,000 questions I'd love to ask. But one of the things that I come across when doing that research was the Merleys review, which I'm sure you might be familiar with. IFS produced a report on tax reform, and I was struck, Mr. Osborne, when you were saying earlier that most budgets, there's 4,000 decisions, most of which many people will agree with, and then there's a few sort of politically defining things that you want to do on it. That seems to indicate that you don't really want to look at a budget as a moment to take a holistic view of the tax system. And it's become quite fashionable now for people to be saying, actually, our tax system's a mess. What we need is proper tax reform. So I just wonder when that Merley's review was issued, what you thought of it. Did you just chuck it straight into a shelf going, this is politically impossible? Or did you try to think more deeply about what proper tax reform of Britain would look like?
I mean, I did attempt a number of tax reforms and tax simplifications, and we created an office for tax simplification, which has now been abolished. But I'll give you, one example was a big simplification of pensions taxation. Which was seen as getting rid of the requirement to annuitise, but that's actually, it was a reform of taxation, giving people essentially much more freedom over what they did with their pension. That was a big tax simplification and kept entirely secret till budget day because of its market sensitivity, and I think generally regarded as having gone well. The stamp duty reform, which I got rid of the slab system, cut stamp duty for 98% of people, did increase stamp duty on high rate properties, which is the only thing people remember, and then all the thresholds were frozen for all the years afterwards, and so as a result it's kind of crept up again. So there were kind of individual pieces of tax reform. I think
those are quite small fro reforms.
So I think to be realistic, when I was Shadow Chancellor, we did a big review into a flat tax. The truth is, if you say we're going to abolish income tax, national insurance, we're going to create, income tax has been around since William Pitt the Younger. There are good reasons why every Chancellor who's been in office for a while and wants to do their big tax reforming budget looks at merging national insurance and income tax and backs away from it because it's just very, very hard to do.
You did set up the Office for Tax Simplification, as you said. So I guess you recognise that there was a need for fundamental simplification, but we've got the most complex tax system ever now. So did you miss an
partly
opportunity?
because Parliament wants to achieve, governments want to achieve all sorts of things. They want to encourage people to save for their pensions. There's a big pressure now. In Scotland, we want the Scottish Parliament to be able to set different rates of tax. There's pressure to allow English mayors to have more tax powers. All of these things lead to complications. And when you want to encourage particular forms of investment or saving, you create things like the EIS scheme. All of these things equal tax complexity. And then people say, well, the tax code's got longer and longer, but the individual bits in it are things that broadly people want, which is tax breaks for enterprise.
To push you then, the people who are calling for tax simplification or major tax reform, are they just politically naive? Are we doomed to have a more complicated tax system as we have to appease all these different sectors in the economy?
I think you'd have to have a period where money was flowing into the exchequer, not the case at the moment. And that was the political priority of the government. So the two kind of moments when it was done in the late 80s by Nigel Lawson, and it was, I think, probably the Blair government would have had an opportunity to do it in its second term, but chose instead to use the money that was coming in, the unexpectedly higher forecast revenue, to increase expenditure on public services.
Thank you.
What specifically would you both do now if you were in the Chancellor's hot seat on tax reform?
Well, I think if you could merge income tax and national insurance, it's sort of odd we have two taxes on income, but they are, of course, taxed on very different forms of income, different ages of people. It's quite complicated to do. I did look at it pretty closely.
Vince?
Yes, I mean, your basic point that politics and economics are very difficult to reconcile. I mean, I started my professional life teaching economics students in Glasgow about the theories of Adam Smith, and then going down to the Glasgow City Chambers in the afternoon and doing the opposite. I'm afraid that is the world we live in. I think my one thought is we try not to be sort of very academic about it. It's very easy to come up with, how you would reform the property taxation in a perfect world, or how you would reconcile income tax. It wouldn't be for the Chancellor just to choose one area. And I think the income tax, national insurance is probably the best. It also has the effect of bringing in new taxpayers, landlords and earning pensioners like me into the tax net. So that that would be one thing to do. But it's not difficult to think of areas where there is, a grotesque mismatch between the economics and the politics. I mean, if I just give one further example, we've cut fuel duty by 40% in the last 15 years or so for political reasons. It's bad for revenue, it's bad for the environment. And any academic economist would say we should be moving across to road users pricing, which we're going to need anyway when we have electric vehicles. But the politics of that are just very, very difficult.
So the last Chancellor who tried to increase fuel duty was me, and I got defeated by the Labour opposition and Tory backbenchers.
And
Dean.
So, Kevin, we talked a little bit earlier on about the growth in the size of the state, and Mr. Osborne remarked it's really started in 2019. I think a lot of time we talk about this, you talk about it like it's a political choice, but of course there's been quite a lot of demographic change in our society. More money spent on pensions, more money spent on healthcare for those pensioners, and more sickness benefits for people that are at the sort of late stage of their career. So KB, you also talked about this being one of the defining inequalities in our society between the generations. Do you think we need to be thinking about tax reform in that context as well, changing in a society that is changing?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with George in believing we should start off being neutral between tax increases and public expenditure cuts. We have to be trying to be dispassionate about it. But it's actually very difficult now to cut public expenditure. I mean, it's not just the aging of the population, which is a very powerful driver, but of course you've got defence spending on top of that. But in terms of dealing with demographic change, a future government, and I'm sure this isn't going to happen in 3 weeks' time, is going to have to look at things like the triple lock, which is a wonderful idea when we did it, but and very progressive and lifted a lot of pensioners out of poverty, very commendable all round, but it's not sustainable and makes no sense in the long run. And you're going to have to move to a double lock or something, and this government or the next one is going to have to grasp the nettle which Andy Burnham and Theresa May both failed to grapple with. I think we tried to in the government of trying to get people to pay for care other than through the council tax system. I mean, these are the kind of big, meaty, reform issues which governments keep backing away from because they're too difficult. But precisely because of demographic change, you're going to have to be faced.
I think, can I just say, to give a couple of outstanding examples of cross-party cooperation in reducing burdens on the state, the cross-party cooperation on raising the pension age, so a report commissioned by a Labour government, implemented by the coalition government, the auto-enrolment in state pension, in pensions, private pensions, which has increased savings in our society. Again, something started under a Labour government and introduced under the coalition government. Tuition fees, commissioned by the John Major government, implemented by the Tony Blair government. Then a further top up that there are various things that the parties have managed to cooperate on in a way that we know now sort of take for granted. But they...
State pension age, it was your government that then increased it at shorter notice, giving
Yes.
less time for people to plan. That was a deliberate decision, presumably, to save money.
In the aftermath of the financial crisis, to show that the country was getting a grip on its public finances.
It caused a lot of havoc for people. Anyway, I've got an issue. We'll come on to pensions in a moment.
I think a lot of that was to do with the raising the female state pension age
Yes.
in the 1990s, which was passed through Parliament, widely advertised at the time.
And that was changed at very short notice for people.
For both men and women.
Yeah, but it compounded that first point. But anyway, we're coming on to pensions. Catherine West.
Thank you, Chair. Two quick questions. One about national insurance and one about the national living wage and London living wage, regional living wages. Yeah. The first one, national insurance, obviously quite controversial change by the Chancellor last year, which some employers were very unhappy about, but which over time might end up creating more balance or revenue. Your assessment on that particular element, because conversely there's currently a think tank who is saying no, we'll do the opposite
we've got the question.
to spur jobs. And the second question is just on the living wage and that sort of entry level, pushing up entry level, and what your views are on that way that it's slightly abutting now entry level graduate jobs, etc. Not the committee hasn't taken a view because I think it's, but I think it's an interesting point for you having introduced the NLW and those of us who have introduced the London living wage to have a reflection on that.
Vince, do you want to take that first?
Well, I mean, the national insurance on employers, I think, was based on the assumption that employers would pay it, but they don't. I mean, it's passed back to workers and it cuts jobs, and it was not a good tax, and it's damaged business confidence, and it stemmed from the fact an unwillingness to raise taxation through the main tax system. But one of the main damaging consequences, it's provided a big boost to the gig economy, because Deliveroo don't play employers' national insurance. I mean, it relies on the honesty of their people, deliverers, to do it. So, national insurance on employers had all kind of negative secondary effects. In terms of its interaction with the minimum wage, I mean, I think we know from our experience in government that the minimum wage, living wage, extremely popular. And I think we competed with each other at the end of the Parliament to see who could make the best offer on the minimum wage. But I think we now have to recognise that it is in problematic territory. I think the so-called bite, which is the difference between the highest level of the minimum wage and average graduate income, is now about 65%. There's now relatively little incentive for people to get a degree or a higher skill qualification, and that's a major constraint on pushing it further.
I think it's a combination. I mean, we as a coalition government, we actually reduced employer national insurance, and one of the things we would talk about at the end of that Parliament was that more jobs have been created under that Parliament than any other Parliament in British history. And that was against the backdrop when people thought unemployment would rise, not fall, because of the financial crash. I think the trouble is it's the combination of three things. You've got the increase in employer national insurance, you've got the rising living wage. I'm very proud that we introduced that, and the incomes of the lowest paid have increased markedly over the last 10 years as a result. But the combination of the employer national insurance rise, higher minimum wage, plus the employment law changes, that's a triple whammy at a time when unemployment is starting to rise, and we mentioned earlier, you're potentially about to have this AI revolution that is going to make it much easier not to employ people and get computers to do things instead. And you might find in 3 or 4 years' time, and it could happen as quickly as that, you've got quite a serious unemployment problem, which we haven't seen in Britain since I was a teenager, really.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. West. UN Yang MP.
On the spending, we've done the spending cuts section.
Okay, you want to skip? Okay, Mr. Bobby.
Yeah, earlier on we spoke a little bit about the OBR. I think Mr. Osborne, you said the OBR needs to back off a bit, and so Cable, you said that they're instead of marking answers, they're starting to set the questions. There's been a lot of talk about the degree of fiscal headroom the Chancellor's left herself and how much that's a problem in on itself, incessant tax speculation for the last year or so, for example. How much headroom should the Chancellor seek to build? Can I go to you first, Cable?
Well, I think George gave a very eloquent description of the political problems with headroom, but in terms of the sort of basic economics, I think we have had evidence of growing volatility in the big macroeconomic factors governments have got to deal with. We've got the possibility of a big shock that might come. I mean, we've had COVID, we've had the financial crisis, we've had Brexit. There may well be others coming over the horizon. This big AI boom, which is producing remarkable results for the companies involved, it may indeed produce productivity growth. It may also be a bubble, and you can have a very painful correction that would have significant effects on financial markets, including ours and including the economy. So, there's a very powerful argument in principle for having a significantly higher level of headroom than we've got at the moment. but bearing in mind the politics of how you deal
Also,
with
just
it.
don't. I mean, it's
Before
not.
we come to Mr. Osborne, can I just pick up on
course.
something you said about the OBR backing off? Did you mean by that perhaps the Treasury should be allowed to stick to some of its own forecasts and what they think that the trade deals are going to happen or the impact of the planning bill? So, and then they take the political risk of that. So the OBI kind of assesses it and says how likely or not that is, but the actual figures that are turned out from are based on government forecasts. What did you mean by that?
So, let me be absolutely clear. The OBR is blamed by the people on the right who want to cut taxes and not cut expenditure to make those tax cuts affordable, and it's blamed on the left by people who want to raise spending and think that's going to pay for itself. And so the OBR does a very good job at telling both that their plans are fantastical. I think where it's partly because of the low headroom that the Chancellor's operating under, it's got into a kind of daily dialogue with the Treasury about the impact on GDP of other measures the government's taking, the Prime Minister's trade deal with the US or India or the immigration white paper or whatever it happens to be. And if I was the OBR, I would not try and sort of micro forecast all of these broader economic policies, because then I think you end up with the Treasury. I mean, the Treasury is brilliant and I loved working there, but I know exactly what the Treasury officials will be doing, which is let's get them to score the trade deal and then we won't have to put taxes up on, pasties or whatever it happens to be.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dean. John Glenn, MP.
Can we turn to welfare and pensions policy? I mean, 22% of total government spending is on welfare.
Yeah.
You talked, Mr. Osborne, about the achievements around auto-enrolment, and you also talked about, Sir Vince, about the issues around the triple lock and what the achievement was there. Would there not be a way of dealing with that pressure by putting a ratchet on the increase from 8%, which is generally seen as inadequate as a total amount of saving on pensions, so that generally over time people would be forced to spend more on their pension, and put some sort of time limit on the 2.5% ratchet, given outside of the pandemic, only 1 year of the last 10 we've seen growth in the economy at above 2.5%. Isn't there room for some quite radical reset in the area of pensions? And do you think the Chancellor would be well advised to do it? Mr. Osborne.
I definitely, I think increasing the auto-enrolment rate is a very good idea, and it's ultimately optional, although people have to opt out of it. And I think it's been a really successful UK policy pursued by governments of all colours.
But not adequate enough at 8%.
Well, I know, yeah, but so you can increase it. But I think you have to, the system's been established, it's now well respected, and most people are participating in it. On the triple lock, I mean, of course, when it was introduced, it was actually a Liberal Democrat proposal in the coalition talks, which we agreed to. There had been a whole, I think it's worth remembering, Barbara Castle had been out there campaigning for years. There were big marches around pensioner poverty in the 90s and 2000s. These were, it didn't come out of the blue, this policy. It was designed to address a really serious problem, which was pensioner poverty. I'm not saying pensioner poverty doesn't exist today, but it is, we're in a markedly better position. Unless you're prepared to go back to an earnings link, at the moment it's the inflation that's triggering the triple lock. So that's not a double lock, that's a single lock of going back to the Margaret Thatcher policy of linking the pensions to earnings. And if you want to go back to that, the ghost of Barbara Castle will come and revisit this government.
Can I just sort of probe around this area? So, Vince, did you want to come in and say anything different on that?
Well, I think, where you answered the question with yourself. If we moved from a triple lock to a double lock, simply remove the mandatory 2.5%, which is way in excess of current or expected economic growth, that would provide pensioners with protection, but it would also put it on a more sustainable basis.
Can I ask you about the issues of the future liabilities in terms of pensions? Because we've obviously got some quite big differences in the public sector liabilities going forward, and some opposition parties have been looking at this. And Mr. Osborne, when you were in government, you introduced the career average imperative. What do you see as scope for reform in this area, given the wide discrepancies now between DB and DC pensions and what that means for our society?
Well, I think you would have to address public sector pay if you were going to get rid of career average DB schemes in the public. You'd have to bump up kind of annual pay. Remember, it's an overall package in the public sector, which is often forgotten in the pay negotiations, that they're getting but they've got more job security and they've got pensions. I don't think that's the sort of first thing I would look towards, to be honest. I mean, I think, now you've got the career average schemes. I mean, personally, I didn't really see the point of the last Conservative government getting rid of the limit on lifetime pension savings, which I had brought down. The reason they did it was because you run into problems with DB schemes for consultants, judges, senior military officers, and dare I say it, members of the government. But I think they can be addressed somewhat separately, because otherwise,
looking into it in some detail, Chief Secretary.
I know it's very complicated, but it's quite if you're looking for ways to save money, it's I don't know. I thought. I didn't think it was necessarily the right.
You think Chancellor should actually be doing things to pensions at a budget rather than in a long-term approach? Because let's take the lifetime limit. So you introduced it, you focused on it for a bit while you were Chancellor, then you stopped being Chancellor and no one uprated it. Then it hit these problems, which actually in 2012 in the Public Accounts Committee we were picking up that people were leaving jobs because it wasn't worth their while working. Doctors and so on were retiring early because they could afford to. And nobody then really kept an eye on it, and then we hit these big problems.
I think it was more like tail wagging dog, because it was particular problems in public sector DB schemes where notionally there's a very large pension pot, although of course it doesn't actually exist, it's funded out of current taxation, and it hits the lifetime allowance. But as a result, they got, the last government got rid of the lifetime allowance, so people, wealthy people can put a lot of money into pensions again. I don't know. I mean, it's just sort of struck me as, in terms of pension reform, I think it's true. I mean, I would argue that pension reforms we introduced were successful in 2013 and 2014. I mean, actually, Ruth Kelly's pension reforms were pretty effective as well when I was in opposition. If you look back at the
But there's a lot of but at the dispatch box
simplifications.
and budget day, if you think of the whole of government accounts, which lays out everything, although it doesn't include pensions, and then you've got the budget, as you talked to earlier about the rabbit out of the hat at the end. But is that the right place to make pension policy because of the other political pressures on the Chancellor? Yeah,
because I think it has to be balanced against. You're ultimately got to put all these things into the mix to make your sums add up. I mean, and so it doesn't mean other aspects of pension policy like the pension age and that's separate legislation, separate debates, but I think we're talking fundamentally about the taxation of pensions, and the budget is a tax event.
So, when you were Chancellor, you looked into Michael Johnson's proposal on the lifetime ISA, and it was characterised as an attempt to try and create an alternative savings vehicle. Given that 10 to 15 billion of pension relief is on higher rate taxpayers, and if you'd have had the mass adoption of that vehicle, you would have had different levels of tax relief. I mean, is that something that you think is still unfinished business?
Yes, I mean, if I was given a ninth budget, I would have definitely done. People understand ISAs, right? They were introduced by. Well, there was a precursor introduced by John Major. Gordon Brown introduced ISAs. We increased the limit, £20,000. They're very simple to understand. I think pensions has got unbelievably complicated for people certainly outside of the public sector. And, most people haven't really got a clue what their pension pot is, even very financially literate people. And there is an idea that you could kind of replace pensions with ISAs, essentially as a vehicle for saving. And so that things are, tax-free on the way out rather than tax-free on the way in. And I was very tempted to try and do this. I made the big mistake, I mean, actually this comes to your point, Chair, of sometimes in budgets, the rabbit out of the hat does work. So the pension reforms and the sugar tax I introduced, I think if I had announced a sugar tax in advance, consulted on it, it would have been killed by the industry and lobbying forces out there. But it was done as a surprise in a budget, and so by then it's already happening and people can react to it. On the pension changes, I with hindsight, the mistake of consulting on them. The pensions industry went mad, and I had to back off.
Thank you. So Vince, anything to add?
I don't have a great deal to add. I think one of the great difficulties we had in the coalition, and I think maybe George is too modest in not acknowledging it, that when we did try to push through public sector pension reform, there was widespread industrial action. It was one of the most controversial and difficult things that we had to do, but it did partly address the problem you describe. And although it wasn't ultimately a matter for the government, actually one of the difficulties was persuading members of parliament to accept a more stringent...
And judges.
And judges to accept.
It took 10 years to resolve.
I mean, you had advice in the Treasury about that this could break the law, and then the McLeod case obviously threw that up and created...
And I'm receiving lots of letters about McLeod now.
It's created, chaos for people. Some who have to make decisions won't make decisions until their point of retirement. Yeah. So it's keeping kind of parallel systems running in effect. Huge cost to those pension things. When you're making a budget, there are decisions that you could make in one budget that can have a long-term. I call them the George Osborne ticking time bombs, because there's a few like this that which we'll maybe get to if we have time at the end. But this was one that has caused a lot of. Were you aware of that in the heat of the 4,000 decisions you're trying to make in the budget?
I think the public sector pension reform was done more across the government. I mean, certainly driven by the Treasury wanting to get it done. The subsequent McLeod judgment and problems, obviously did not come up at the time, or else. A lot of it.
We had some warning that there would be a problem about equality law on this. It was warned at the time.
Not that I recall. Mainly it was me and Len McCluskey in my office having lots of rounds of negotiations and getting him to. We dropped the auto-enrolment in the Labour Party in return for him agreeing to career average pension schemes.
Well, there we go. We learn something new every day. Mr. Dean.
Just a quick one on, and it's been mentioned already, obviously the state pensions and public sector pensions coming from general taxation. This feels to me like quite a big and increasing forecasting problem for the long run of the public finances. Should we be getting the OBR to sort of independently review and forecast what that liability looks like? Should we be doing anything more radical than that? I mean, or do we just keep dealing with the fact that we need to pay for these out of general taxation a year-on-year basis? I don't know. So, Cable?
Well, I think as part of the kind of more general oversight, which the chair's alluded to, that trying to deal with pension issues piecemeal, and particularly in a budget, isn't very helpful. But that trying to get a cross-party, deep analysis, whether the OBR does it or some other body that has more people. I mean, the OBR is actually quite a small organisation, but it seems to be a secondary issue.
The independent review is a much underused device these days, but again, trying to be unpartisan. The Blair Brown government used it pretty successfully quite often, and I would say we used it, and it's a way of trying to create a parliamentary consensus.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dean. Chris Coughlin, MP.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Osborne, in the spring statement, the Chancellor was able to upgrade GDP by 11 billion a year using the uplift in defence spending based on a fiscal multiplier of 1.6. That comes from Palace Rico on how you can use defence R&D to raise economic growth. The reason I say that is I listened with interest to your podcast on the debt doom loop on the way in, which I think you did back in July. But isn't there potentially a third way in terms of that challenge around fiscal constraints, which is that Europe faces a fundamental strategic challenge with the disengagement of the US and Russia? We all know it needs to increase defence spending. So if Europe issued debt, pooled debt to raise defence spending, you use the fiscal stimulus from that to boost economic growth, and you don't spook the bond markets because you've done it in conjunction with our European allies, you could therefore deliver a fiscal stimulus and perhaps help partially offset the doom loop that you suggest.
Yeah, I think it's my fellow podcaster on political currency, Ed Balls, who said that the government did have an opportunity earlier in this year to come off its fiscal rules or create an additional fiscal rule, saying because of the defence threat from Russia, we could borrow outside the rules. And of course, the German government essentially did that.
Yeah, exactly.
He judges, Ed judges and Bull's judges, and I would judge that today that moment has passed somewhat for the UK and for this Chancellor, that the bond market is, I think, sitting more heavily on her shoulders, and that moment of that window of opportunity has passed. I mean, I would say, it's quite a crude fiscal stimulus. I think originally, actually, John Maynard Keynes said that sort of defence spending is not your ideal fiscal stimulus because you're trying not to use the things you're building, your missiles and artillery shells and so on. But you're right that it can certainly spur innovation. It's been a big. I referred earlier to my role at Stanford. Stanford was partly built on the back of US military spending and innovation. I would say the single biggest challenge in the space, not for this committee so much, is the innovation you want to be encouraging. I would fear that increases in defence spending at the moment are going into cost overruns on old programs like frigates and armoured cars, rather than the very different battlefield we see in Ukraine.
Yeah, if we're talking about defence and how to manage defence spending in an economically useful way, I would refer to the work that's been done in the industrial strategy. I think one of the biggest reasons that persuaded me, and I think my colleagues, to adopt an industrial strategy in the coalition was what was happening to the British aerospace industry, which is at the heart of defence procurement. It was disappearing without government 50-50 funding of R&D. Much of the industry and its supply chains would have simply disappeared. And this government has introduced an industrial strategy. It's been quite quiet about it, but this should be very much at the heart of it. But I mean, simply using defence spending as a stimulus, it's questionable. I do remember that when we were debating Plan Bs in the coalition, the IMF produced a report on how you give a best stimulus to the British economy, and I think the Keynesian multiplier for all forms of public spending and tax cuts was about 0. But that public investment was significantly higher, and if you're trying to stimulate the economy, that's probably where you should be looking.
Thank you. So defence R&D is a form of public investment. But more broadly, I mean, you said earlier that the Chancellor was getting it right in terms of increasing public investment. Do you think that the government is putting enough money into public investment? I'm particularly thinking that given it was cut under the coalition.
Well, historically, Britain has a relatively poor record in investment, both private and public. I mean, one of the problems we've battled with over the years was the sort of Treasury orthodoxy, that public investment is a waste of money, that it inevitably crowds out private investment. I think we did demonstrate that that's not correct. You can have sensible forms of public investment, and the industrial strategy work on co-financing the automobile industry and aerospace was a good example of it. I think one of the best examples was the Green Investment Bank that we set up. We got 2 billion from the Chancellor, and it leveraged, I think, another 10 billion from the private sector. It was co-financing. For some reason, George's successor decided to get rid of it. But there are many instances like that where properly deployed public investment can stimulate private investment rather than replace it.
Mr. Osborne, do you think the government's got the right approach to public investment, or should it be increasing, or be putting it in different areas?
Yeah, I thought the Chancellor was quite smart in adjusting the fiscal rules at the last budget to allow for that new definition of public investment, taking into account kind of net assets. I think you could have presented an alternative budget last autumn, which might have actually had a more positive reaction, where you raised, obviously taxes were raised. I think if the government had spent more of that money on infrastructure, on investment in the economy, I think the markets would have reacted more positively than they did. If you follow the bond market while she was giving her budget, it's when she announces that the money is going into current NHS spending that the bond market goes, what are you up to? and that, so I mean, I think in this budget, if I were her, I would return to that thesis, which is I'm borrowing money to invest in R&D and infrastructure and the like, and make more of that than they currently do. But in the speech yesterday, growth and public investment didn't feature as one of the priorities for the budget.
Given what you've just said, do you, and what you said earlier about the US productivity greatly increasing over relative to the UK and Europe, I mean, do you think the lack of public investment under coalition was perhaps part of that issue?
Well, I won't get back into all the kind of arguments at the time. Yeah. We thought we were increasing public investment off the plans that Alistair Darling had left us and made a big deal of that, but it was an overall reduction. So we were saying we're doing more than the Labour government was going to do, but the overall impact was a reduction in public investment as part of an overall reduction in public expenditure after the financial crash. I think there are definitely things, road schemes and the like, we actually came back to. Like, we cancelled on arrival the A303 Stonehenge tunnel through John Glenn's constituency, or nearby anyway. And then 2 years later we reinstated it. And then Rachel Reeves cancelled it in the first,
like a yo-yo.
First month.
The traffic jams continue.
So there are definitely kind of yo-yo things. I would say generally I found as Chancellor the frustration was actually a lack of big projects to invest in. I was sort of demanding, where's the Transpennine rail link we can invest in? Where's the, some of the big ideas? Where's Crossrail 2? And I look back on...
My constituency.
But, interesting, on the very first day I was Chancellor, the Treasury said, why didn't you cancel the Elizabeth line because it's not built yet and no one's going to notice it not being there. And every time I travel on it, I go, thank God we didn't cancel the Elizabeth line.
Sorry, you made a very interesting point there about the lack of projects to invest in, which is quite interesting, just given the negative real interest rates you experienced at the time. I mean, was that a key missed opportunity to invest, or was that more a lack of projects?
Well, I think we could have done. We tried to course correct in the middle of the Parliament on some road schemes that we had cancelled, and then we reinstated, some of which have been built. But there's on the road. But I mean, without getting to, they just John Prescott cancelled a load of road schemes. Alistair Darling reinstated them. I cancelled them, then reinstated them. Then they got and I guess if you were looking for a kind of longer term decision making, you could try and get some kind of parliamentary consensus on road schemes or indeed rail schemes like HS2, where you need long time horizons, and you can't have every. Particularly as there have been 7 chancellors since me, you can't have every chancellor cancelling the thing the last person did.
Okay, you and Yang briefly on this then.
Thank you, Chair. Just to add on this point about capital spend, Mr. Osborne, you mentioned in an interview that you regret the amount of capital cuts that you made during that period, and you mentioned just there that you attempted to course correct. Why was there the attempt to cut capital spending at a time when interest rates were almost zero, so you would have had effectively free money for the government to invest?
Well, I mean, so we were operating off essentially the baseline that we inherited from the late Alistair Darling, and he had built in plans to cut the deficit, which at the time was 11% of GDP, and he had a big cut in capital spending, and we in the coalition said we were actually doing better than what we'd inherited. But of course, with the passage of time...
But that's not what residents or
No, of course, with the
feel.
passage of time, you look back on it and you go... I mean, this is, a challenge which is sort of easier to see when you're outside Parliament than when you're in it. At the time, you think you're doing one better than the people who came before you and you're outfoxing your political opponents. But then you take a step back and go, well, maybe that just was the wrong thing and we should have totally rethought the capital budget. And then we definitely cancelled some things which we later had to reinstate, or wanted to reinstate, which obviously was not ideal. But I do think, even if we'd massively increased the capital budget, first of all, it would have put more pressure on current spending at a time when we had such a high budget deficit. It would also all put more pressure to raise taxes. And the borrowing, it's all very well saying zero interest rates or negative interest rates. At the time, a lot of our European neighbours were in fiscal crises. Greece,
we were in the euro at the time, but
yes,
I'll pass back.
No, but the Liz Truss mini budget or the quasi-quating mini budget, and this Chancellor's experience twice in the last year, once when she was doing the budget and once a couple of months ago in Parliament, when it looked like she might quit, shows you how close Britain is to suddenly the market taking a different view.
I don't think she was looking to quit, just to be really clear.
No, but the market thought she might.
Okay, let's just be clear.
No, of course.
Yeah, I just want to be clear for the record. Sir Vince.
Well, I would confirm that. And actually, this is something we did have quite a lot of strong internal debate about in the coalition, about why we couldn't borrow at low interest rates for investment. And the answer, I think, George has given, that what the advice we were getting from Treasury and our economic advisors was that the bond markets don't distinguish between capital and current spending. It's all borrowing. I mean, that was the argument that was thrown back at us. I think with hindsight, many things that the coalition did in fiscal policy that I strongly defend, even though they're unpopular. But I think this is one area where, with the benefit of hindsight, we could have taken a different track. But bear in mind the specifics. I mean, the one big public investment that was in front of us was HS2. I think it still accounts for half of public sector spending. I think when it came to our cabinet, the benefit cost ratio for HS2 was about 1.6 or something, which is barely credible. Then a subsequent government decided to do the low value part of the project rather than the high value part of the project. But we're not dealing with this in abstraction. We were dealing with real world problems in terms of borrowing and real world problems in terms of a limited range of projects, of which that was the biggest one.
Okay, thank you. John Glenn, MP.
Can I turn to Brexit, trade and tariffs? And
My favourite
like
topic, Brexit.
Yeah. Previously, last year's budget, the Chancellor didn't mention Brexit as a cause of productivity performance. Yet, in the last few weeks, and in her speech yesterday, she did. Why do you think that is, Mr. Osborne?
Well, it's the word that dares not be mentioned by British politicians. Well, it hasn't been since 2016 for different reasons, and there's been a kind of conspiracy of silence in British industry and the trade union movement and everyone else to not talk about the very obvious, to the rest of the world, damage that Brexit has done. Now, that's not to relitigate the referendum. It's to say you could have left the European Union in a very different way and with much less economic damage. And indeed, at the time, there was a strong argument from some Brexiteers that we could have stayed in the single market and stayed in the customs union.
Should she look to rejoin those?
Well,
now?
I personally, but this is all, thought that the Labour government should have rejoined the customs union on entering office, and would have put the opposition in an impossible situation today of elect us and we're going to come out of the customs union. Good luck trying to get elected on that platform. But they didn't. I strongly applaud what the Prime Minister and others are doing to negotiate a better trade deal with the EU, and I would urge them to double down. I mean, the truth is there are very few, coming back to my point about levers on the desk, building a railway is going to take 15 years. Negotiating a better trade deal or services agreement with the EU is something within your gift and the gift of the European Union negotiator, so it's not just yours, but it's something that can be done by ministers, by governments. It's not, we all want to improve skills in the economy, the transport system, healthcare. We want to help people on sickness benefits. These are things that are urgent, but are going to are very difficult to manage in large and complex democracies. Negotiating a better trade deal with the EU is something that could be done in a matter of months.
Given, Mr. Osborne, what you previously said about the shift in the sort of growth in the US compared to the EU, how do you, in your mind, reconcile the enhanced opportunities that you would say exist from the rejoining the customs union and single market with the fact that actually the shift in productivity in the top 7 economies is coming from the US, not from the EU?
So partly, of course, what no one says is that Britain's absence from the European Union has itself made the European Union in some ways less dynamic, and the British voice is not heard when devising things like financial services regulation in the EU. So I would say the EU has missed Britain. Second, for many small and medium-sized businesses in your constituencies, they've given up exporting to the continent of Europe. It's just far too difficult. So there's still a physical trade in goods that you can improve dramatically. And the fact that, Europe collectively, ourselves included, have not sort of got our act together in terms of productivity and over the last 5 or 6, 7 years does not mean, vis-a-vis the US, doesn't mean we can't try going forward. So, these are all reasons why we should cooperate with our largest trading neighbour without rejoining, the European Union, without reopening the debate on free movement and, those are things, if I were running this government, they'd look to me like pretty easy wins, quite straightforward things to deliver, and you, using my old hat as a person who ran 2 general elections, you trap the opposition.
Thank you. So Vince, would you like to add anything?
Well, I think my position on Brexit was always fairly clear. I don't want to just rehearse all those arguments, but the Office of Budget Responsibility has now pulled together the empirical evidence, which suggests that the cost to our GDP is even worse than some of the more pessimistic projections. I think we're talking about GDP being 5% less than it otherwise would have been, and that probably excludes the damage to business confidence, because there was a very sharp fall in business investment immediately after 2016. And I think the government's own impact assessments show that the total value of all the bilateral trade deals that we've signed, including the United States, are the equivalent of adding about 0.5%, so that we've gained 1/10 of what we lost in sort of crude quantitative terms. And I would add to your point about the United States that there is an obvious desirability of remaining close to the United States in economic terms, but the agreement we've reached was essentially about mitigating the cost of tariffs. It wasn't improving market access. As far as I know, it's not a treaty, it's a provisional agreement. And one of the things that we gave up in the process was our technological sovereignty. Accepting that we can't tax or regulate big tech companies, which is an extraordinary thing for the government to have conceded. But to finish on a positive note, George just suggested some of the things that the government ought to have been doing or could be doing. I would add that this annual process that has now been set up does seem to be a very positive step. It gives a means by which business groups and others can now bring forward concrete proposals on particular aspects of regulation that need to be aligned. So there is some light at the end of this tunnel, I think.
Thank you.
So Vince Cable, just to build on what you just said there about 10% of the value being made up by these free trade deals compared to the deal that we had with the European Union. Would you say that's in net terms? Because obviously the EU is free to negotiate trade deals with all of these other countries as well. So are you saying that one of the freedoms of Brexit means we've been able to get those trade deals over and above the value that the European Union could strike, or are you just saying in isolation?
You're pointless.
Yes, well, the European Union has itself reached agreements with, I think, Mercosur, ASEAN, potentially India, which, had we remained in the European Union, we'd have been able to take advantage of. So I think the measurements of this government, or the last government, were gross rather than net, but I'm not sure exactly how they did their calculation.
Thank you very much. Chris Copeland.
Thanks, Chair. Just a general question. With the policies you implemented in coalition, do you have any regrets, and that you would advise the Chancellor to do differently?
Who's who first?
Mr. Cable. Sorry, Sir Vince.
Well, I don't regret going into the coalition. I think it was actually forced on us by circumstances. There were quite big ideological differences, which were genuine, and we had to reconcile. But I think the political facts in 2010 didn't leave us with any other option. And the fact that there was a major financial crisis in the background meant that we had to act responsibly. So I'm glad we entered the coalition. I think it was the right thing to do. There were a whole lot of very specific things which the government did, which I was uncomfortable with. But, that was, I think we were all in that position. And although people, quite, rightly pick on particular sectors, like the justice system and the police, which have suffered particularly badly over a long-term period. I'd also point to some of the things that we did that were quite courageous on public spending, which subsequent governments haven't been able to do. I mean, a good example was the aid commitment, the 0.7%, which we upheld. The fact that this government's walked away from it like the last one is doing us, I think, a great deal of damage to our reputation and to our national interest. And so there were positives and negatives. I could give you lists of both.
But just on that point, I mean, the world has changed quite considerably. Our Prime Minister's not sat having a pint with the President of China anymore. The world and defence and the risks facing the country are different. Are you really saying that you think if you were in office now that you'd be able to maintain aid expenditure at that level?
Well, we might have had to change the focus, but the principle was right, and actually the aid budget is not being used for alternative foreign policy reasons. It's been used to support the asylum hotels. I mean, it's just a bit of rather cheap public accounting, actually. So, we were under very strong attack at the time, I have to say. A lot of George's backbenchers absolutely hated it. But it was something that we kept going. And I would simply add, because it was my own personal bailiwick, that we did put a substantial amount of commitment behind our industrial strategy financially, although there was an opportunity cost to that, and a lot of people would have said instead of supporting the car industry or the aerospace industry, you should be increasing benefits here or there. So, we did make some difficult but right choices.
You were also bound into decisions, weren't you, because of the coalition, the Quad arrangement? So you had to stick to things, you couldn't just change. Mr. Goldett.
Same question for you, Mr. Osborne, and I'm also just, if you could cover, I'm particularly interested in the decision to dismantle Sure Start as well within your answer.
Yeah, I think so. I echo what Vince said about the coalition. Obviously I'm extremely party-free, but I think people might look back on that as the last time there was a kind of stable government with a clear plan, and whether you liked it or not, they got on and did it. And there were some very major public service reforms as well during that period. So in terms of, I would say on education, the education reforms were one of the great achievements of that government and have led to marked improvements in English school standards. And unfortunately, you can compare them directly with Welsh and Scottish school standards to see that there probably was a difference in the way that English education was handled during that period compared to the rest of the UK. And on early years, I think that's an open debate. I'm not sure kind of shiny new Sure Start centres popping up everywhere were necessarily the best investment in early years, and there was a big commitment on nursery education, which actually has been built on by the Sunak government and now by the Starmer government. So we did that. I mean, I think the two kind of, apart from the political regret, which was I suggested to everyone involved that we should fight the 2015 election as a coalition, but no one agreed with me. If you look at the sort of two, I mean, healthcare reform was a massive missed opportunity. The attempt to the healthcare reforms sucked the energy out of returning to NHS reform, which basically no government since has dared return to, although arguably Wes Streeting's abolition of NHS England is the first kind of attempt in many years to attempt to do that. So that would be one sort of missed opportunity. Without getting too technical, I didn't kind of go back into the banking system because Alistair Darling had done a lot of the heavy lifting there, but in fact RBS was heavily impaired, and for the first 2 years, I think it was lending. Half of all small businesses in Britain had an account with RBS, and it was still basically squeezing its balance sheet, and there was a credit crunch on, and it took us 2 years to kind of reopen the deal on RBS. And I think, finally, if you think of talked about my first budget. My last budget, a member of the cabinet resigned on me because I tried to curb incapacity and disability benefits. And that was the last attempt until this year. A government's really had at trying to do that. And of course, as you see from Charlie Mayfield's excellent report today, which has got lots of great things in it about what you can do to positively support people in the workplace and the like. But you've also got this ballooning bill, which is going to squeeze out all the other things you are collectively going to want to do as parliamentarians.
Thank you. Yuan Yang, MP.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Osborne, just to follow up on that, you mentioned that you don't regret scrapping Sure Start because there could have been other investments in early years that would have been more effective. Did you make those other investments?
Yeah, we did make investments in free or extended free nursery education. So we made nursery education. We also introduced free school meals for the first 3 years of primary school.
And you felt those were more effective than keeping Sure Start?
Well, I would note, just on Sure Start, there is a Labour government. If they want to reintroduce Sure Start, they can.
Is there a particular...
That goes against everything you spent the last 2 hours talking about.
Yeah. So would you propose that this Labour government continue with
I think investment in early years is a good thing, and anything you can do, anything you can do to make childcare. No, well, we did invest in free school meals and in free nursery provision for parents. So that was more putting the money into the hands of the parents to get more affordable childcare. I think the evidence at the time on Sure Start was mixed. I know there's been work since. As I say, a lot of the money it felt at the time had gone into sort of big new buildings, which isn't always the best use of public money.
So was there evidence at the time you were given by the Treasury or other departments about the cost effectiveness of Sure Start?
I think it was generally felt at the time that it had not been very cost effective.
It was generally felt, but was there evidence? Because you just referred to
Well,
evidence.
I think I don't have perfect recall.
Okay.
I'm happy to kind of come back to the committee, but I don't remember everyone saying this is really working well and we shouldn't get rid of it. Otherwise, there would have been if you think about it at the time, there also would have been a big political obstacle to getting it done, which there wasn't.
I think the families who used Sure Start would have had a different feeling about that, but let's zoom back.
Yeah, and actually, you were talking about putting a nursery education, but Sure Start was a lot more, wasn't it? It involved health, it involved parental support. And if you look at some of the impacts on what we're seeing now as young people, the high number of them on PIP, but having been on DLA or EHCP, there's a whole trend of young people who haven't had support, and the cost to the Exchequer long term of that is enormous. You haven't touched on welfare. So did you not do it? In the rush to make the changes for the budget changes that year, were you thinking long term about this impact, or was that something that was just not a concern?
Well, I think at the time it was felt that it was overly focused on quite capital intensive new Sure Start centres.
They weren't supposed to have desks. I do remember that people got desks a bit more than they're supposed to be out there, but that could have been resolved, could it not, without actually just...
Well, as I say, I think the overall the education reforms and the investment in free nursery education and the investment in free school meals, were positives in that space and have been borne out by education results, which presumably also reflect people's early years.
Okay, well, look at Mr. Coughlin.
Let me follow up on that. Are you worried at all that perhaps the scrapping of Sure Start and all the evidence that early intervention is very effective in terms of childhood outcomes, that combined with the education reforms, which absolutely you're right, raised educational standards as a whole, but the increased focus on test taking may have harmed the less able children able to cope with that? The combination of those two may have contributed to the special educational needs crisis we're facing now, or you think it wasn't? I'm not sure it's connected to the rapid increase in the number of children who are being designated as needing special needs. Even though in 2010 there were 1.6 million special needs children, and there's 1.7 now. I think there are also, incentives in the welfare system that drive the classification of children.
Thank you. Yuan Yang.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to zoom out a bit more, since we're talking about the regrets of the 2010s. I was in university during the 2010s. And
a young parliament.
We can go into many different regrets in that stage of my life, but I was studying studying economics during the coalition government, and I want to return to the topic of growth that we had at the beginning. At the time, the kind of accepted orthodoxy of the economics departments was that a desire to run a surplus budget at a time when the economy was under capacity, recovering from the financial crisis, and interest rates were very low, would be leaning in the opposite direction of promoting growth and the recovery back to the equilibrium output. So, Mr. Osborne, do you feel that your attempts to run that surplus undermined the growth and the recovery?
Well, we ran a deficit, albeit a reducing deficit, throughout the time I was Chancellor. And we slowed the growth of debt because we were reducing the deficit. I think at the time there's two things. We now know, but it was sort of obvious at the time, that a financial crash, which happens thankfully, historically, has happened every kind of 60, 70 years, is an enormous shock. And I think you can identify a lot of what has happened in Western politics and governments to the impact of that shock. And we were in the immediate aftermath of that. And so I think this assumption that you could immediately bounce back to the kind of pre-shock levels of growth was, unrealistic. And, there's no historical precedent for that. And second, Vince has alluded to it, I've alluded to it, and frankly, the last 3 years of British politics has been a salient reminder that we were sitting in a situation where we just didn't know whether the bond market would lose confidence in the UK in the way, I agree with Eurozone countries, it was losing confidence in some of those countries. But they were near, we had to make a loan as a country to our near neighbour Ireland at that point. Spain was in trouble, Slovakia was in trouble, Greece was in trouble, and so on. So it was not obvious that Britain was insulated from those changes, and we were running a budget deficit of 11 or 12%. And, the truth was, he's not here to kind of defend himself, but if in the conversations I used to have with Alistair Darling, he was also very aware that this was a really difficult situation. And if you read his memoirs, he actually says one of the things I would have done was put up VAT, which at the time his Prime Minister screamed blue murder about.
At the time, did the Treasury, which I presume had the similar mainstream orthodox view of macroeconomics that academic economists had, did the Treasury warn you that attempting to run a contractionary budget would delay the recovery in itself?
No, well, if anything, the Treasury orthodoxy was we needed to go further. I think because they also thought we wouldn't have the political will in a coalition. It was a hung parliament for the first time since the 1970s, and a coalition since the first time since the Second World War. And people did not believe that this government was going to be able to do anything. They thought that the coalition would fall apart, that it would be paralysed. But in fact, working, with Vince, with Nick Clegg, with Danny Alexander, Ed Davey, a welcome member of the cabinet I was part of, these were, we made big decisions. And I think it comes back to the point I made earlier, like plan beats no plan. If there was one piece of advice I give the current Chancellor, that's not a bad motto.
And by the 2015s, 2016, central banks and central bankers were also coming out to not directly criticise but hint at problems with this monetary fiscal settlement. Central banks had been trying to lean against the impact of a contractionary budget. And for example, Mark Carney in 2016 warned that the bank on its own couldn't lift growth off for the UK economy. Andy Haldane, the chief economist at the time, has had much more direct criticisms of your contractionary policy. Do you reflect on those interventions?
Well, I would say both Mervyn King and Mark Carney subsequently, would say to me that because of the tight... remember, by the way, this was not nearly as tight or contractionary, as you put it, as almost all European countries were running at the time. And indeed the United States of America, though it talked of fiscal stimulus under the Obama presidency, the truth was state governments were running contractionary fiscal policies across the United States. And in fact, the fiscal path of the UK and the US is almost identical during that period, if you look back on it. And the Obama administration and Larry Summers were talking about fiscal stimulus. We were talking about austerity or getting the public finances in order. But in fact, we followed a pretty similar path, and it was milder than a lot of European countries were forced to follow. And I stand by the results, which was the fastest recovery of any of the G7 economies, the most jobs created of any parliament in British history, incomes of the poorest 20% rising faster than they'd done in the previous 10 years. Lots of things I'd like to have done more with, but unfortunately, this country had a vote on the EU.
Oh. Bobby Dean, MP.
Yeah, I want to take the long run view as well. So we've talked about the bond markets, but of course they will respond to a variety of economic models. So there's no one pathway. It's just you need a credible plan. And I think the coalition's plan was to weigh more heavily on spending cuts than tax rises. I think there was an 80-20 rule, or not a strict rule, but that was one of the things that was said. And given where we are now with the sort of social infrastructure, the foundations economy, you've mentioned the justice system, policing, there are lots of concerns about NHS and welfare state now. If you was to take a 25-year view, would you still make the same decisions, or would you weigh a little bit more heavily on the tax side to ensure that social infrastructure doesn't disintegrate? Can I come to you first, Sir Vince Cable?
Well, I think, within the coalition there wasn't a wide range of disagreement, but I think probably the Conservative colleagues would have preferred to lean more on spending and us to take a bit more out of tax, but we'd have been talking about 70-30 rather than 80-20. And I think one of the key factors which produced that coefficient was the fact that on the Lib Dem side, one of our priorities was to lift the threshold on low earners for income tax. So we were arguing for a substantial tax cut for people on low and middle income. So in a way, we contributed to that 80-20 mix that you describe. Can I just, it was the sort of introductory part of your question, just to make the point about, which I think we've missed a little bit in the discussion, about why Britain has this particular extreme vulnerability in bond markets. I mean, there's a mixture of factors. I mean, the United States is getting away with far more reckless policies than we would ever have dreamt with, because they have a global currency. We're not anchored in the Eurozone, and the shift away from final salary pension schemes mean that we don't have institutions which are trying to soak up government bonds in the way that the Japanese have. So we simply don't have the options that many other countries do to manage external public borrowing, and we're therefore particularly vulnerable.
Mr. Dean.
Mr. Osborne, do you want to respond to that point about the 25-year view of social infrastructure and whether or not we're weaker now because we lean too heavily on public spending cuts?
Well, I don't think that was the case back in 2010, 2015. What I would generally say is that, you don't have to run such a tight policy in peacetime, if you like, outside of the kind of aftermath of a financial crash, but you do need to require reform in return. And I would say, when you look at the justice system, I think if anyone's got experience of the court system, I think could ask legitimately, I keep hearing about it's all to do with money and inputs. I think you could legitimately ask the court system and the legal profession and the judiciary whether they might reform the way they handle themselves and in return for money. So I would, if I was the current government, I would do more kind of striking deals, which is we'll invest in return for reform. And that was, if you look at the kind of most successful period of the Blair government, Blair-Brown government, they were demanding reform in return for additional public expenditure.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dean. Catherine West MP.
Thank you. 2 quick questions. The first is...
Do one at a time, perhaps?
Yes. Boris Johnson introduced a hard Brexit, but also left a legacy of 1 million newly arrived community in migration terms per annum as his legacy. Would your advice be to the current Labour government to seek entry to the European Union again?
No. I don't think we sadly can rejoin, because you'd have to... it doesn't seem to me entirely... I don't exactly know why as a country we've decided to swap kind of rest of the world immigration for European immigration, but I wasn't in the government at the time.
Well, I certainly, rejoining tomorrow is not an option. In the very long term, it may well be, and probably would be desirable, but it will be a fundamentally different organisation. You know, if Ukraine is a member in 10 or 15 years' time, we'd be joining something quite different, and which probably has different member states with different sets of obligations, a much more flexible system than we've had. So the answer I would like to see us rejoining, but over a very long time frame and in a much more open-minded approach.
The second question I had was your former colleague from Surrey Heath, Mr. Gove, did say publicly that his biggest regret was cutting the Building Schools for the Future programme. And I just wondered what yours would be on reflection.
Mr. Osborne, you've been quite bullish about the positives. Was anything you would say?
Well, no, I think the healthcare reforms were a mess. I mean, and that's such a big area of government spending, and it basically frightened us off ever kind of returning to it. And it is annoying because, the Labour MPs around here, this is such a rare opportunity you get. You've won an election, you've got your majority, you haven't been in office a while. This is the moment to be doing the things that are difficult to do. And, healthcare reform is the kind of thing you can only pull off in the first couple of years of a new government. And, that was a mess.
Vince?
Certainly in our time there were reforms that weren't exactly stellar. I mean, probation reform was probably the worst example. But I had the hospital pass of dealing with universities. I didn't expect to be dealing with universities in government, but I inherited the problem. And we were faced to a situation not totally dissimilar from today. We had a substantial number of universities going bankrupt. If the government had simply applied the same public spending controls as we had in other bits of government, large numbers of universities would have had to cut departments, cut staff, and probably overall fairly drastically cut the number of students going to university. So we had to find another mechanism. And the unpopular but necessary step that I had to take was to substantially increase the fee level that the previous Labour government on the system that they had introduced. And it's kept the universities solvent and expanding for 15 years. Of course, they've now got back to the same point that we inherited. But that kind of approach that we adopted, I think, was the best of some horrible options.
We did try and make a graduate tax work, and we just couldn't make it work.
Yes.
We really did spend a lot of time inside the coalition, as I think the Brown government did, trying to make a graduate tax work. And
this is something that needs to be a cross-party decision that runs over long term, for sure. The two-child limit, Mr. Osborne, you introduced, and we had some very good evidence last week saying that had no impact really on fertility one way or another, whether you have it or not. Do you have any regrets? Because that has definitely pushed children into poverty.
No, absolutely not. I think it's perfectly fair to ask people in society who are in receipt of benefits to make the same kind of choices that most other families have to make about whether they can.
But some people make choices and then they find themselves, as we heard very clearly last week. So you can have 3 or 4 children, be working, everything's fine, then you're widowed, separated, lose your job, and suddenly you need some support. And the social security system, I think we would all agree, there's not going to be a safety net there. We can argue about how that works, but that safety net isn't there for those children when their family circumstances change.
Yeah, the vast majority of families in Britain have to make choices about when they have additional children, the cost that that's going to bring. And certainly the system that I was reforming back in 2016 had this strange financial incentive at the bottom of the income scale, and that was reflected.
We've had evidence that says that that's not what makes people have children. Certainly, I have constituents who are in very difficult circumstances, and one area of agency they have is to have that 3rd or 4th child, sometimes for cultural reasons and otherwise. So it's not. Where was the evidence? Did you have evidence to suggest that it would actually make people make family decisions off the back of the benefits?
Well, at the time, first of all, it commanded broad support at the time. I think there was quite a lot of Labour support at the time for what we did, and at the time, there was certainly evidence of that there were mounting financial incentives for large, families with large numbers of children. That this was also, by the way, deeply resented by much of the rest of the population. And I think of all the polling I've seen since, it remains a very popular measure. So all I would say is if it's going to be changed...
There's a lot more children in poverty now, though, as a result. And is the quickest, changing this would be the quickest way of getting children out of poverty. So your government oversaw your government and subsequent governments of your party oversaw a massive rise in child poverty.
I think if you're trying to look ahead at where the public might be in 3 or 4 years' time, an overly generous welfare system might be a big challenge.
Well, there's a difference, isn't there, between a generous welfare system and supporting the children who have no say over their future, and also with the falling birth rate, which was not, I think, the situation when you were in power. But now, would you argue there's a need for investment in our children, the ones that we've actually got, because we're not immigrations?
I would personally
gone down or going down because of Europe.
I mean, we can have another discussion about immigration, but personally, I think immigration brings lots of benefits to our country.
The point is, we're not in a sort of world where we've lost the European migration, so we don't have migrants, and we've got a falling birth rate. So investing in the children we've got might make a sensible.
Well, I certainly think if you were trying to look at it from a kind of, how are you going to get Britain going again? Investing more in education, less in incapacity benefits, more in schools, less in all the kind of apparatus of an ageing society would be a sensible thing to do. But I'm not sure if I had the money and I had to choose, as this is what chancellors have to do, between Sure Start and getting rid of the 2-cap limit. If I was a Labour chancellor, I'd put money in Sure Start.
Okay, well, I'm sure that the Labour chancellors listening, Mr. Cable.
I'll just say, there's one area I actually do disagree. I think the two-child limit, if resources permitting, should be one of the highest priorities of the government. I mean, it's not just, as you say, it's child poverty, it's a bad thing in itself, but, we are producing large numbers of very young people, 5 years old, with very stunted development, which has major long-term economic costs, and that's something we continue at our peril. I've just emphasised that although welfare reform, I know the government's looking at this with the Timms review, the working age population share of GDP in benefit has been pretty constant for about 30 years. There may be particular quibbles about the way invalidity benefits are applied, but overall we cannot argue that the share of the national economy going into working age benefits is ruining the country. It isn't. It's being very stable. And within that, I would certainly prioritise the 2-child limit, and also improving the tapers for universal credit, and dealing with things like the extreme limitations on, say, 8-hour working before you start losing benefit. That whole thing should be made much more flexible.
I think it's worth noting that universal credit and actually benefits to children going often to families in work, about half or just over in some cases. I just want to quickly touch on frozen thresholds, big debate here. So if either of you were the Chancellor now or in government now, Sir Vince, what would you be saying about the because that is going to drag, or the fiscal drag is real. Is that something that you're concerned about? Sir Vince first and then Mr. Osborne.
Well, fiscal drag is one of the worst ways of it's politically attractive because it's relatively concealed, but the big choice we had in the coalition, this government has as well now, which is, do you just allow income tax receipts to rise by freezing thresholds, or do you go for the basic rate? And it's clear that allowing fiscal drag to operate is much the more regressive of the two options, because people on low incomes are dragged into the lowest band, and the people on the lowest middle incomes are dragged into the 40% band. So I would have a very strong preference for taking the politically difficult decision to raise rates rather than to allow fiscal drag to continue to operate.
George Osborne.
Well, I mean, when we were in government, we did the exact opposite. We raised thresholds. That was our big signature kind of attempt to help the working poor with their tax bill. But this is the kind of debate we would have in the coalition. This is exactly because, Vince would say it makes economic sense to raise the basic rate of income tax. And I would say, yeah, but we can actually get away with freezing the thresholds. We did the opposite. But I'm saying if you were sitting in the Treasury today, I think if the Labour Chancellor raises income tax rates for the first time since the 1970s, that is going to be, having specifically promised not to do it in a manifesto, that is going to cause real political hardship for the government. And it might make more sense for the very good reasons that Vince has said, but continuing the Conservative government's income tax freeze looks like a much more attractive option if you're actually putting together a budget.
Thank you. John Grady MP.
Just a quick question for Mr. Cable then. The poorest families in Britain faced a double whammy because they lost Sure Start and they lost the two-child cap. And I'm not aware of any academic evidence at the time that showed that the two-child cap would influence the number of people, number of children people would have.
We heard last week that it doesn't.
I think, and so the question is really twofold. First of all, did the government take proper account of the long-term costs? Leaving aside the ethics, and it's deeply unethical for me, did they take account of the long-term costs of these two measures in terms of lost earnings and lost prospects for that cohort of people who are affected? And secondly, do you think the coalition government had a sufficient eye on the distributional impact of its policies?
Well, we did produce distributional impact assessments, actually. They were critical, but we did produce them and we were aware of them. I can't honestly recall the decision-making around the two-child...
Well, to be fair to you, Vince, it was actually introduced after the coalition ended in the Conservative government. But I would say we did commission a piece of work at the request of the Liberal Democrats, which was what are the public expenditure cuts that disproportionately affect the upper income brackets as opposed to lower income brackets. And the three policies that the Treasury came up with were university fees, jack them up more. Second, get rid of free museum entry, not something I'm in favour of now, I'm chairman of the British Museum. And free swimming lessons, which had been introduced by the tail end of the government that had come before us. And we said no to all three, beyond what we'd already done on tuition fees.
Did you actually have academic evidence, Mr. Osborne, about, kind of robust evidence, about whether introducing the two-child cap would seriously influence people's behaviour and decisions about having children, as opposed to just general say-so?
We produced at the time, and we had internal evidence on the distributional impact of the policy and its impact on child poverty, and we were confident that we could go on reducing child poverty.
But Mr. Osborne, gently, because I don't want to appear rude at the end of a long hearing,
That's right.
and you've been very patient with us, was there evidence about the influence of the policy on people's decisions as to whether to have children or not? Because one of the key
we heard last week that it didn't make any difference.
I mean, to be honest, it's not that I don't know the answer to the question because I can't recall whether there was a specific piece of paper that came to me around that, but it was felt clear that we clearly felt at the time, and it was widely supported actually across the political spectrum, that there were disproportionate incentives in the welfare system, which is why there was a clustering of.
You're suggesting basically that people were having babies to get benefits.
Well, it wasn't so much that they were having babies to. They weren't so much that they were having babies to claim benefits. It's just that the conversation that many families in Britain have, which is, can we afford another child, was a conversation we wanted all people to have.
Well, people were having, but what we heard last week, people were having that conversation, quite possibly, while working, and then something happened in their life, and then they needed support.
The great thing about there now being a Labour government is you can reintroduce Sure Start and get rid of the two-child cap.
Well, there we go. There's some suggestions for the Chancellor. Look, I thank our witnesses, that's Vince Cable and George Osborne, very much indeed for their time. A canter through interesting memories, good and bad, different takes on what happened in your time government, but we thank you for your time because there are not many people now, sadly, with Alistair Darling who are alive, who were in your positions having to make these decisions, so we really appreciate your time. The transcript will be available on the website uncorrected in the next couple of days if you want to have a look at that. Thank you to our colleagues at Hansard, and thank you to our broadcasting colleagues at Bowtie. Order, order.